The poisonous smog of Xerxes Prime had liquefied the lungs of 1 billion settlers, melting their organs like a screaming, pus-filled jelly. Not even the hardiest terraforming races like the Daxamites could last a minute, that is, until humanity crash-landed into town. Grizzled Space Captain Mark Cox regaled the wide-eyed recruits. Reclining with a flask of rye, he launched into the grisly tale. "Look, I know you've heard of the arrogant, scaly Daxamites and their terraforming circuses." Mark swished the flask, recounting the details from memory. "They seed cute little paradise worlds for 1,000 species that can barely handle rain. Fishbowl domes, bunny rabbit meadows, pansies, the lot of them. Pansies. Xerxes Prime, though? Xerxes fucking Prime? Calling it a death world ain't the half of it. Gravity 6Gs flattens your guts to goo. Air's mostly boiling acid with a pinch of cyanide. And the surface temp? Hot enough to sear-fry every damn Daxamite that blundered out an airlock. Of course, by the time us humans showed up, the galaxy already wrote Xerxes off as a good place to store hazardous waste. We impressed the scaly bastards, sure, scrapping up a starfaring civilization in record time, but the fishy freaks still laughed when the Terran Federation asked for Xerxes as our new home. The recruits exchanged wide-eyed looks of amazement, leaning in as Mark continued the tale. His eyes crinkled as he smiled at the memory. "The Daxamites thought we'd gone space crazy when we picked Xerxes Prime, but give 'em credit, they still agreed to help out, probably figuring we'd be running home with our tail between our legs in a month. They sent some fancy environment suits, a couple of terraforming machines. Mira even dropped by with her egghead pals to watch us fall on our asses. But let me tell you, those scalies don't know jack shit about human guts and grit. Sure, them first pioneers got the shit kicked out of them. Acid ate through their helmets. Gravity felt like a sumo wrestler sitting on their chest. Even lifting a fucking wrench was like bench pressing a boulder. But did our boys quit? Did they fuck? Nah, they got to work building airtight habs, tinkering and tooling till the tech could handle the hellhole. And you know what they found? Only the strongest, lightest metal in the whole damn galaxy. Called it Xerxium. As the colony got bigger, Mira and her crew got real interested in how we pulled it off. She thought she'd be teaching the backwards apes a thing or two, but the shit she saw blew her little lizard mind. Mark's eyes grew solemn, the twinkle fading as he delved deeper into the tale of Xerxes. Now Mira, she was one tough egg to crack. Her team touched down, scoffing and snorting, thinking we were pulling their tails about the whole shebang. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But hoo boy, did we open their eyes. A smirk tugged at his lips. They strutted out expecting to see us crawling on our bellies. Instead, there we were, standing tall, hydroponic farms churning out grub, geothermal rigs keeping the lights on. Hell, we'd even started terraforming bits of the hellscape. Should have seen Mira's jaw hit the dirt. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. Spent months poking her snout into every nook and cranny, trying to suss out our tricks. Mark chuckled. Even bunked with us, the mad lizard. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. That's when the wrenches started flying into the works. Mark's voice lowered. Nothing major at first, a glitchy doohickey here, some funky chow there, but it didn't take a genius to sniff out the sabotage. He clenched his fists. As the hits kept coming, it was clear as Xerxes' skies. Some scaly bastard was out to sink us, and they weren't going to stop till the whole damn colony was space dust. The attacks turned downright fucking vicious. Explosions gutted our habs, sending bodies flying. Shrapnel sliced through suits like tissue paper. The damn saboteurs hacked our life support, venting atmo and spiking CO2 till folks were choking on their own blood. The recruits shuddered. The brutal reality of Xerxes Prime laid bare. We were dropping like flies, no two ways about it. Each day we'd drag more corpses into the airlock, sending them to their final resting place among the stars. Mark paused, the weight of memory heavy on his shoulders. But if those scaly bastards thought we'd throw in the towel, they had another thing coming. Our security boys worked round the clock, tracking every lead, chasing down every suspicious blip. Engineers patched up the leaks and bolted down the hatches, keeping us from being spaced in our sleep. A flicker of admiration crossed his face. And in the middle of this shitstorm, Mira comes to me with this wild-eyed look, clutching a bunch of readouts. She'd been digging into the sabotage, see? Trying to suss out how they kept blindsiding us. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Turns out the tech they were using, light years beyond anything we had, cloaking devices, phase shifters, the works. Stuff even the Daxamites hadn't declassified yet. Mira, clever girl she is, starts pulling on threads, and the more she unravels, the uglier it gets. Shipment manifests, coded transmissions, all pointing to some shadowy cabal at the top of the Daxamite food chain. Here was a goddamn inside job. A bunch of high-ranking scalies getting their jollies by trying to bury us. They were so fucking threatened by a bunch of hairless apes making it on Xerxes, they were willing to throw their own people under the bus. He slammed his fist on the table, the recruits jumping at the sudden outburst. Mira figured it out, and those bastards knew it. Knew she'd blow the whistle on their little scheme. So they did the unthinkable. A tense silence fell over the room, the recruits holding their breath in anticipation. Mark paused, his voice heavy with the weight of Mira's revelation. The recruits leaned forward, hanging on his every word. The colony leaders were in a bind. No two ways about it, he said, shaking his head. Mira had 'em dead to rights. The evidence was ironclad. But they knew that if they went public, the Daxamites would flip their shit. Best case scenario, they'd yank their support and leave us twisting in the wind. Worst case, we'd be looking down the barrel of a full-blown interstellar shitstorm. The captain took a long pull from his flask, the amber liquid sloshing against his lips. But they couldn't just sit on their hands either. Not with the colony bleeding out one accident at a time. They had to do something, and fast. He leaned back, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. So they hatched a plan, a real crazy one even by our standards. They decided to invite the Daxamite bigwigs to Xerxes Prime, give 'em the grand tour of our little slice of hell. The recruits exchanged incredulous glances, murmuring among themselves. I know, Mark chuckled. It sounds like a damn fool idea, but they figured, maybe if the Scalies saw what we'd built with their own eyes, they'd think twice about trying to tear it down. And who knows, maybe they'd even start to see us as something more than just a bunch of uppity apes. The captain fell silent for a moment, lost in thought. When the Daxamite delegation touched down, you could cut the tension with a knife. But our boys, they played it cool, rolled out the red carpet, gave 'em the VIP treatment. They showed 'em everything. The hydro farms, the geo-rigs, the Xerxium foundries, everything we'd built from scratch on this godforsaken rock. The recruits listened intently, their eyes wide with wonder. And as they walked the hab blocks and talked to the colonists, something started to change. You could see it in their faces, in the way they held themselves. It was like they were seeing us, really seeing us for the first time, not just as some primitive spacefarers, but as equals, as partners in the great galactic dance. By the time they left, the Daxamite leadership was singing a whole different tune. They promised to root out the bad seeds in their ranks, to work with us to build a better future for both our species. And that, my friends, is how a bunch of hairless apes from a backwater planet earned the respect of the mightiest empire in the galaxy. The recruits erupted into cheers, their voices echoing off the bulkheads. But Mark held up a hand, his expression suddenly serious. For of course it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows from there on out. We still had our share of challenges to face, both on Xerxes and beyond, but that's a story for another day. For now, let's just say that when the history books talk about the great alliance between humanity and the Daxamites, they'll be talking about Xerxes Prime and the brave men and women who refused to back down, even when the odds were stacked against them. Mark stood abruptly, the recruits straightening in their seats. But we're not here to rest on our laurels, are we? We've got work to do and a whole galaxy to explore. So let's get to it, rookies. Time to show the universe what humanity is really made of. The recruits nodded eagerly, their faces alight with determination. They knew that they were part of something bigger now, a legacy that stretched back to those first intrepid settlers on Xerxes Prime. And as they filed out of the room, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, they couldn't help but feel a swell of pride in their chests, pride in their species, their history, and the indomitable spirit that had carried them to the stars and beyond. Even as the Daxamite leaders toured our colony, marveling at the impossible made real, a sinister plot unfolded in the shadows. His voice was heavy with the weight of memory. Not all were swayed by what Xerxes had achieved. Some, the very same bastards who'd tried to bury us, saw their power slipping away. And they would sooner see the colony burn than watch humanity rise. Knuckles white around his flask, Mark pressed on. It all came to a head during the farewell ceremony. Humans and Daxamites stood together, celebrating a new era of cooperation. But the festivities shattered in a heartbeat. His words painted a visceral picture, the recruits almost feeling the searing heat and concussive force. Explosions tore through the habitats, a firestorm of shrapnel and debris. As the smoke cleared, armed extremists poured into the ceremony, plasma rifles blazing. Mark's voice shook with fury at the memory. They cut down humans and Daxamites alike, their hatred blind to allegiance. Blood spattered the walls, screams of the wounded filling the air. He met each recruit's eye in turn, his gaze searing. In that chaos, that hell of twisted metal and charred flesh, I found myself back to back with Mira. Strange, how fate forges bonds in the crucible of battle. A grim smile flickered across his face. We fought like cornered beasts, using every scrap of cover, every weapon at hand. Mira was a demon with a plasma rifle, her scales slick with the blood of friend and foe alike. The recruits were riveted, the room electric with tension. Pride glinted in Mark's eyes as he recounted the colony's finest hour. Humans and Daxamites rallied together, a united front against the saboteurs. Engineers jury-rigged defenses, medics braved the crossfire to tend the fallen. Every soul on Xerxes fought with the fury of the righteous. He leaned back, the ghost of triumph on his weathered face. In the end we prevailed. The extremists fell one by one, until only the ringleaders remained. We dragged them before the Daxamite delegation, their treachery laid bare for all to see. Mark drained the last of his flask, the recruits hanging on his every word. Mark's voice grew thick with emotion as he recounted the aftermath of the brutal attack. The survivors stood amidst the smouldering wreckage, their faces smeared with soot and blood. Broken bodies, both human and Daxamite, lay strewn across the once thriving colony. The air hung heavy with the acrid stench of smoke and death. But even in the depths of despair, a flicker of hope refused to be extinguished. The survivors, united by their shared trauma and unwavering resolve, began the arduous task of rebuilding. They cleared the rubble, tended to the wounded, and mourned the fallen, their grief tempered by a fierce determination to persevere. In the weeks that followed, an extraordinary alliance took root on Xerxes Prime. Humans and Daxamites labored side by side, their differences forgotten in the face of a common goal. Engineers from both species pored over the twisted remnants of the colony's infrastructure, devising innovative solutions to restore power and life support. Medics pooled their knowledge to treat the injured, combining human resilience with Daxamite regenerative technology. Mira emerged as a beacon of unity in those trying times. She worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between the two species, her tireless efforts earning the respect and admiration of both humans and Daxamites alike. She convened meetings between the colony's leaders, fostering a spirit of cooperation and shared purpose. Her impassioned speeches rallied support from the Daxamite government, securing crucial resources and expertise for the rebuilding effort. Under Mira's guidance, the colony began to rise from the ashes. New habitats, stronger and more resilient than before, took shape amid the ruins. Hydroponic farms, once again bursting with life, provided sustenance for the growing population. The Xerxium foundries, now staffed by both human and Daxamite workers, churned out the materials needed to rebuild and expand. As the weeks turned to months, something remarkable began to take hold on Xerxes Prime. The shared struggle had forged bonds of friendship and understanding between humans and Daxamites that would have been unthinkable just a short time before. They worked together, laughed together, and even mourned together, their shared experiences creating a deep and lasting connection. And then, in a moment that would be remembered for generations, the Daxamite government made a stunning announcement. In a formal declaration, they acknowledged the legitimacy of the human presence on Xerxes Prime, recognizing the colony as a shining example of what could be achieved through cooperation and mutual respect. They pledged their full support to the ongoing terraforming efforts, vowing to work hand in hand with their human partners to transform Xerxes Prime into a beacon of hope for the entire galaxy. The news was met with jubilation throughout the colony. Humans and Daxamites alike celebrated in the streets, their joy tempered by the knowledge of all they had endured to reach this moment. And as they looked to the future, they knew that the alliance forged in the crucible of Xerxes Prime would be one that would endure for generations to come. "It was like something out of a science fiction novel," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Humans and Daxamites working side by side, building a new world from the ashes of the old. We had our differences, sure, but we also had a shared purpose, a common goal that brought us together in ways we never could have imagined." He gestured broadly, as if painting a picture in the air. New habitats sprung up like wildflowers, each one a marvel of engineering and ingenuity. We took the best of both our technologies and combined them in ways that were truly revolutionary. The Daxamites' advanced material science, our expertise in adaptive systems. Together, we created structures that could withstand anything Xerxes Prime could throw at them. The recruits murmured in amazement, their eyes wide with wonder. "And the terraforming," Mark continued, his voice hushed with reverence. "That was the real miracle. With the Daxamites' help, we were able to accelerate the process 100-fold. What had once been a barren, hostile wasteland began to blossom with life. First, it was just small pockets of green, but soon entire regions were transformed, the once toxic atmosphere giving way to breathable air and clear skies. At first, it was just a few requests for technical assistance, a bit of advice here and there. But soon the requests became more insistent, more demanding. Some even wanted to establish their own colonies on Xerxes Prime, to share in the bounty we had created." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "It was a delicate situation, to say the least. We had to balance our desire to share our knowledge with the need to protect what we had built. There were debates, arguments, even a few heated exchanges. But in the end, we found a way forward. A path that allowed us to welcome new allies while still maintaining our autonomy. And then, just when we thought we had it all figured out, the Zorgians arrived." Mark's eyes twinkled with mischief. They were a strange bunch, even by our standards, all tentacles and eye stalks, with a scientific curiosity that bordered on obsession. They'd heard about Xerxes Prime and wanted to see it for themselves, to study the unique challenges we'd overcome. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But they didn't come empty-handed. No, they brought with them a gift, a technology so advanced, so revolutionary, that it made everything we'd accomplished seem like child's play." The recruits held their breath, waiting for the reveal. "Bioengineered life forms," Mark said, his voice filled with awe. "Creatures that could adapt to any environment, that could evolve and change in ways we'd never dreamed possible. They called them Zorgian Adaptive Life Forms, or ZALs for short." He sat back, letting the information sink in. It was a game changer, a breakthrough that opened up new frontiers for exploration and expansion. With the ZALs at our side, there was no limit to what we could achieve, no environment too harsh or too hostile for us to conquer. The recruits buzzed with excitement, their imaginations running wild with the possibilities. But as with all great powers, Mark said, his tone turning somber, the ZALs came with great responsibility. We had to be careful, had to make sure that we used them wisely, that we didn't let our ambitions outpace our ethics. It was a delicate balance, one that would test us in ways we never could have imagined. He paused, his eyes distant as if lost in memory. And that's when things started to get really interesting. The recruits leaned forward, hanging on his every word, eager to hear what came next in the incredible saga of Xerxes Prime. Mark's voice took on a tone of cautious optimism as he continued his tale, his eyes scanning the eager faces of the recruits. The Zorgians' bioengineered lifeforms were a marvel, there's no denying that. They could survive in conditions that would kill any other creature, adapting and evolving at a pace that defied belief. It was like something out of a science fiction novel, watching them grow and change before our very eyes. He leaned back, his hands clasped behind his head. At first we used them mainly for terraforming, accelerating the process of turning Xerxes Prime into a livable world. The Zaals could break down toxic compounds, convert the atmosphere, even seed the soil with the building blocks of life. It was incredible, seeing the barren landscape transformed into a lush, vibrant ecosystem. The recruits nodded, their eyes wide with wonder. But as we studied the Zaals more closely, we began to realize that their potential went far beyond mere terraforming. Their unique biology, their ability to adapt and evolve on the fly, opened up entire new fields of research and development. Medicine, materials science, even space exploration, the Zaals had the potential to revolutionize them all. Mark's expression turned thoughtful, his brow furrowed. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the Zaals. Some folks, both human and Daxamite, were wary of the idea of engineered life, saw it as unnatural, even dangerous. There were protests, demonstrations, even a few attempts at sabotage. But in the end, the benefits outweighed the risks, and the Zaals became an integral part of life on Xerxes Prime. He chuckled, shaking his head. I remember this one time, we had a particularly stubborn group of colonists who refused to work with the Zaals, saw them as an affront to nature. They set up their own little enclave on the far side of the planet, determined to tough it out on their own. The recruits leaned forward, sensing a story. Well, wouldn't you know it? A few months later, a massive storm hit their settlement, wiped out half their crops and damaged their habitats. They were in a bad way, no doubt about it, but just when things looked darkest, a swarm of Zaals appeared on the horizon, drawn by the distress signals the colonists were broadcasting. Mark's eyes twinkled with mirth. Those stubborn bastards, they didn't know what to make of it at first. Here were these creatures they'd rejected, coming to their aid in their hour of need. But the Zaals didn't hold a grudge. They just got to work, shoring up the damaged structures, replanting the fields, even helping to treat the injured. Within a week, the settlement was back on its feet, and the colonists had a newfound respect for the Zaals. He shook his head, chuckling. It was a turning point, a moment when even the most stubborn among us realized that the Zaals were more than just tools or experiments. They were partners, allies in the great adventure of building a new world. The recruits murmured in agreement, their own prejudices and preconceptions challenged by the story. From that point on, the Zaals became an integral part of life on Xerxes Prime. They worked alongside us in every field, from agriculture to industry to scientific research. They even joined our exploration teams, venturing out into the stars to seek new worlds and new challenges. Mark's voice took on a note of pride, his chest swelling with emotion. It was a golden age, a time of unparalleled progress and prosperity. With the Zaals at our side, there was nothing we couldn't achieve, no frontier we couldn't conquer. We were unstoppable, a force for good in a galaxy that desperately needed it. He paused, his expression turning somber. But as with all golden ages, it couldn't last forever, and when the darkness came, it came from a direction we never could have predicted. The recruits shifted uneasily as Mark recounted the unfolding crisis. His voice was heavy with the weight of memory, his eyes haunted by the horrors he had witnessed. It was like something out of a nightmare, he said, his hands clenching into fists. One moment the Zaals were our greatest allies, the key to unlocking the full potential of Xerxes Prime. The next, they were our worst enemy, a threat to everything we had built. He shook his head, his expression grim. At first the changes were subtle, a strange mutation here, an unexpected behavior there, but as the weeks passed, the problems began to multiply. The Zaals grew larger, stronger, more aggressive. They started to compete with the native species for resources, disrupting the delicate balance of the ecosystem. Mark's voice grew strained as he described the escalating crisis. We tried to contain them, to keep them isolated from the rest of the colony, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. They adapted to every barrier we put in their way, evolving at a rate that defied comprehension. The recruits listened in horrified silence, their imaginations painting vivid pictures of the chaos that must have ensued. Soon the Zals were everywhere, rampaging through our crops, tearing apart our habitats. They seemed to have developed a taste for our technology, using their newfound intelligence to sabotage our systems and steal our resources. Mark's voice dropped to a whisper, his eyes distant, and then the attacks began. At first it was just a few isolated incidents, scouts who ventured too far from the colony disappearing without a trace. But as the Zals grew bolder, the attacks became more frequent, more brutal. He paused, his face twisting with emotion. I lost count of the number of friends I buried, the number of families torn apart by the Zals' relentless assault. It was like the colony was under siege, with no end in sight. The recruits exchanged glances, their faces pale with the realization of the true horror of the situation. We fought back, of course. Every man, woman, and child who could hold a weapon took up arms against the Zals. The Daxamites, too, once they realized the severity of the threat. We formed hunting parties, organized defenses, did everything we could to protect what was left of the colony. Mark's voice grew stronger, his eyes flashing with determination. But it was Mira who truly saved us. While the rest of us were fighting for our lives, she was searching for a solution. She studied the Zals' behavior, analyzed their genetic code, looking for any weakness we could exploit. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and then she found it. A way to modify the Zals' genetic structure, to make them susceptible to a specific frequency of sound. It was a long shot, but it was the only hope we had. The recruits held their breath, sensing the turning point in the story. We worked around the clock, retrofitting every speaker and sound system in the colony to emit the precise frequency Mira had discovered, and when we finally activated the system, the effect was immediate. Mark's voice was filled with awe, his eyes wide with wonder. The Zals stopped in their tracks, their bodies convulsing as the sound waves penetrated their cells. Some died on the spot, their modified genes unable to cope with the sudden change. Others fled, disappearing into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Mark's voice trailed off, his gaze distant as he remembered the aftermath of the crisis. The recruits exchanged somber glances, the weight of the story heavy on their minds. But even in the darkest of times there was still hope, Mark continued, his eyes brightening. The colony had survived, thanks to the ingenuity and bravery of its people, and as we rebuilt, we did so with a newfound sense of purpose, a determination to create a better future for ourselves and for the generations to come. He leaned forward, his voice filled with intensity. That's the lesson of Xerxes Prime, the truth that echoes through every chapter of our history. No matter how great the challenge, no matter how daunting the odds, humanity will always find a way to persevere. We will always adapt, always overcome, always emerge stronger than before. And that, Mark said, his voice ringing with conviction, is why we're here today, to honor the sacrifices of those who came before us, and to carry on their work of building a better tomorrow, because no matter what the universe throws at us, no matter what new challenges we face, one thing will always remain true. We are human, and we will never, ever give up. The recruits erupted into cheers, their voices joining in a chorus of determination and resolve. And as they looked to the future, they knew that they would face it together, united by the unbreakable bonds of their shared humanity. Mark paused, the weight of memory heavy in his eyes. The recruits leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Implementing Mira's plan was the hardest thing we'd ever done, Mark said, his voice low and intense. It took every ounce of resourcefulness and grit we had. We divided into teams, each tasked with manipulating a different sector of the planet. Some worked to create electromagnetic fields that would lure the life forms. Others set up containment zones reinforced with every scrap of xenium we had left. The recruits shuddered, imagining the horrors the colonists must have faced. Mark's gaze grew distant, his mind transported back to the darkest days of the struggle. I watched good people, friends, torn apart by those abominations, saw the life drain from their eyes as they bled out in my arms. Each death was a blow to the soul, a reminder of how close we were to the edge of oblivion. His voice grew ragged, the pain of the memories etched into every word. But even as our numbers dwindled and our hope faded, we kept fighting, kept pushing forward, inch by bloody inch. Because we knew that if we failed, if we let those things escape Xerxes Prime, the whole galaxy would pay the price. The recruits were silent, their faces ashen with the weight of understanding. Mark took a shuddering breath, steeling himself for the final act of the tale. In the end, it all came down to one last desperate gambit. We managed to corral the bulk of the life forms into a massive ravine, a jagged scar that ran halfway across the planet. Then, with every bit of power we had left, we unleashed a targeted electromagnetic pulse that would fry their adaptive circuits and leave them helpless. His eyes squeezed shut, the memory of that moment still vivid and raw. The pulse lit up the sky like a second sun. The ground shook with the force of 1,000 earthquakes, and when the dust cleared, the life forms lay still and silent, their twisted forms littering the ravine like the bones of some ancient beast. A heavy silence fell over the room, the recruits struggling to process the magnitude of what they had just heard. Mark's voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke again. But our victory came at a terrible cost. The pulse had not only neutralized the life forms, but also wiped out most of our remaining technology and infrastructure. We were left with a handful of survivors, a fraction of the supplies we once had, and a planet that was once again hostile and unforgiving. He looked up, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the recruits. Many chose to leave then to seek a new start among the stars, but a stubborn few, myself included, refused to abandon the world we had fought so hard to save. And so we began to rebuild, stone by stone, seed by seed, drawing on the hard-won wisdom of our struggles and the unbreakable bonds we had forged in the crucible of war. Mark stood, his voice ringing with a fierce, unyielding pride. And that, recruits, is the true legacy of Xerxes Prime, not the grand achievements or the shining cities, but the indomitable spirit of those who refused to surrender, even when all seemed lost. It is a legacy of blood and toil, of sacrifice and unbreakable resolve, and it is a legacy that now falls to you to uphold. Mark turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the silence. But before he reached the door, he paused, his voice carrying back to the transfixed recruits. Never forget the lessons of our past. Never forget the price we paid for our future. And never ever give up, no matter how dark the night or how long the road. For in the end, it is not the strength of our arms or the reach of our ships that will define us, but the courage of our hearts and the fire of our will. That is the true measure of a human. That is the true measure of a Xerxes Prime colonist. With those final words still hanging in the air, Mark strode out into the waiting night, leaving the recruits to grapple with the weight of the mantle they had just inherited. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.